There is a kind of cooking knowledge that never made it into the glossy pages of a modern cookbook. It did not get pinned on Pinterest or filmed for a cooking channel. It lived in the hands of women who rose before dawn, stoked wood stoves, and fed families of 8 without wasting so much as a potato peel. The Amish communities of the 1950s carried a cooking wisdom that went back generations, and the plain housewives who kept those kitchens running had tricks so clever, so quietly brilliant, that even the most resourceful suburban homemakers borrowed them without always knowing where they came from. Most of those tricks are gone now, buried under layers of convenience food and packaged shortcuts. But somewhere, in a hand-copied recipe book tucked inside a cedar chest, or in the memory of a grandmother who still measures flour with her palm, they survive. These are 25 of them. Lard over butter for biscuits. Every Amish cook in the 1950s knew that the flakiest, most tender biscuit you would ever put in your mouth was not made with butter. It was made with lard, pure rendered pork fat kept in a ceramic crock on the kitchen shelf. Butter has water in it, and that water creates steam that toughens the dough just slightly. Lard has almost no water at all, so when it cuts into the flour, it coats every particle in pure fat, creating layers that shatter when you pull a biscuit apart. The smell coming out of a wood stove when lard biscuits were baking was something nobody forgot. Plain women did not buy lard at a store. They rendered it themselves from the fat of the hog they had butchered in November, pouring it clean and white into crocks that sat in the cold cellar all winter long. By the time margarine and shortening convinced American kitchens that lard was something to be ashamed of, a generation lost the best biscuit they would never know they were missing. Soaking grains overnight. Before a loaf of bread was ever mixed in an Amish kitchen, the grain often soaked. Women who ground their own wheat or bought it fresh from the mill knew that soaking flour or cracked grain in a little warm water overnight softened the bran, broke down the phytic acid that made digestion hard, and gave the finished bread a depth of flavor that no quick-rise loaf could match. They called it setting the sponge, and it was not optional. It was simply how bread was made. By morning, the sponge would be alive and slightly tangy, and the bread that came from it had a chew and a crust and a keeping quality that store bread could not touch. A loaf made this way stayed moist for nearly a week, wrapped in a clean cloth. Modern sandwich bread goes stale or moldy in days because it skips everything that made old bread worth eating. Vinegar in the pie crust. Amish pie crust was legendary, and the secret most outsiders never guessed was a small splash of cold apple cider vinegar worked into the dough. The acid in the vinegar inhibited gluten development just enough to keep the crust tender without making it crumbly. It also helped the fat stay cold longer as it was being worked in, which meant more distinct layers when the crust baked. Women passed this tip along the way they passed along everything important, quietly, at a quilting bee, or while shelling beans on a porch. They did not write it down because they did not need to. It was in their hands. Apple cider vinegar was always in the Amish kitchen anyway, made from the orchard surplus every fall, so adding a spoonful to pie dough cost nothing and changed everything. Pressing cheese under a weighted board. Amish women who made their own cheese, which was most of them, knew that good cheese needed pressure and patience. After the curds were formed and drained, the fresh cheese went into a wooden mold lined with cloth, and a heavy board weighted down with a clean flat stone was laid across the top. The pressure drove out the remaining whey and compacted the curds into a firm, sliceable wheel. Depending on how much weight was used and for how long, the same batch of milk could become a soft, spreadable cheese or a firm, aged one. This was not a recipe. It was a craft learned by watching and doing, passed from mother to daughter across generations of women who understood that food worth eating was worth the time it took. No modern cheese press sold at a kitchen store can quite replace the image of a stone-weighted board sitting in a cool cellar doing its quiet work. Drying herbs on brown paper. Fresh herbs from the kitchen garden had to last through a Pennsylvania winter, and Amish women dried them on sheets of plain brown paper spread on wooden shelves in a dry corner of the house. The paper absorbed the moisture that came off the herbs as they dried, preventing mold, while letting the leaves release their oils slowly and fully. Bundles hung from rafters looked beautiful, but they collected dust and dried unevenly. The flat paper method gave herbs that crumbled cleanly between the fingers and smelled powerful enough to season a whole pot of soup with just a pinch. Women sorted the dried herbs into labeled paper packets or small cloth bags and kept them on a dry pantry shelf, well away from the heat of the stove. The flavor of those dried herbs compared to the faded dust sold in modern spice jars is not even a fair comparison. Salt pork in the bean pot. A pot of Amish beans was never just beans. A thick slab of salt pork went in with the first cup of cold water, and the two cooked together slowly over low heat for hours until the pork had given everything it had into the pot. Salt pork is not bacon. It is much fattier, much saltier, and much cheaper, cut from the belly or side of the hog and packed in salt to keep through the winter without refrigeration. When it cooked into a pot of navy beans or Great Northerns, it created a broth so savory and rich that the beans barely needed any other seasoning. Women served this with cornbread and called it a full meal. It was. The salt pork also meant you could skip adding any additional salt until you tasted the finished pot, because it had already seasoned everything as it cooked. Today, most people reach for a ham hock or skip the meat entirely, and the bean pot is never quite the same. Raw apple in the bread box. Amish women knew that a slice of raw apple tucked into the bread box alongside a fresh loaf would keep that bread moist for days longer than it would otherwise stay. The apple released just enough moisture into the enclosed space to prevent the bread from stalling too quickly without ever making it soggy. They did not read this in a magazine. They learned it because they baked bread that had to last the whole week for a large family, and letting it go stale by Wednesday was not acceptable. The apple was replaced every couple of days, and the old slices went to the chickens or into a pot of apple butter. Nothing was thrown away. This was the kind of practical thinking that defined Amish kitchen management, where every small act connected to the next, and nothing happened in isolation. Scalding the milk before custard. When an Amish cook made custard, she never poured cold milk straight into her eggs. She scalded it first, heating it in a heavy pot just until a skin formed on the surface and tiny bubbles appeared around the edges. Then she poured it slowly into the beaten eggs, a thin stream at first, whisking constantly to bring the eggs up to temperature without scrambling them. The scald served two purposes. It killed any bacteria in the fresh raw milk that most Amish families used straight from their own cows, and it dissolved the sugar more completely into the mixture, giving the finished custard a silkier texture. Women who skipped this step ended up with a grainy, curdled custard that no one would compliment. Women who followed it produced a custard so smooth and trembling and rich that guests asked for the recipe every time. Bacon grease for greasing cast iron. Amish cooks did not season their cast iron with flaxseed oil or shortening the way modern instructions suggest. They used bacon grease, plain and simple, rubbed into every surface of the pan with a cloth, and baked it in a low oven until it polymerized into a slick, black coating. Every time bacon was fried, some of that grease went right back into the pan. Cast iron. In an Amish kitchen was never stored clean and bare. It was always coated, always ready, and over decades it built up a seasoning so perfect and so dark that eggs slid across it as easily as they would on any modern non-stick surface. Women who inherited their grandmother's skillet were inheriting 40 years of careful grease and fire, and they knew it. They treated that pan accordingly, wrapping root vegetables in newspaper for the cellar. When the root cellar was stocked for winter, carrots, beets, turnips, and parsnips did not go in loose. Amish women wrapped each one individually in a sheet of newspaper before laying them in boxes of slightly damp sand. The newspaper slowed moisture loss and prevented the vegetables from touching each other, which stopped any rot from spreading from one to the next. A single bad carrot could ruin its neighbors in a matter of days if they were piled together. Wrapped separately and packed in sand, those same vegetables kept perfectly from October to March, arriving at the kitchen table in February, tasting nearly as firm and sweet as the day they came out of the ground. This was not a trick born of cleverness alone. It was born of necessity, of understanding that winter was long and the garden would not come back until spring, so everything harvested in fall had to be treated with care and respect. Stirring pie filling with a wooden spoon to test thickness. Amish bakers did not use a thermometer to test whether a stovetop pie filling had thickened properly. They used the back of a wooden spoon. When the filling coated the spoon in a thick, even layer that did not run when they drew a finger across it, it was ready. This test, called the spoon coating test by some and known by feel alone to most, required a cook to understand what she was looking at and trust her own judgment. It could not be outsourced to a gadget. It meant she had to stand at the stove and pay attention, which is exactly what Amish cooking demanded at every step. The filling that passed this test went into a crust and baked into a pie that sliced cleanly and held its shape on the plate, not a runny mess that flooded the dessert dish and embarrassed the cook. Hanging a mesh bag of onions in the cellar stairwell. Onions needed AIR circulation to keep properly, and the Amish solution was simple. Clean, dried onions went into a mesh bag or an old stocking and were hung in the stairwell leading down to the cellar, where cool air moved upward and kept them dry and ventilated. The same spot that would turn potatoes green from light was perfect for onions, which needed dryness and airflow more than darkness. Women checked the bag every week, pulling out any onion that had begun to soften before it could spread spoilage to the rest. A bag hung in October could last until January this way, keeping the kitchen stocked with one of the most essential flavoring vegetables of the plain diet without taking up a single inch of precious cellar shelf space. Cooking dried beans with a strip of kombu. Long before seaweed became a health food trend, Amish women in communities near enough to trade routes sometimes added a small strip of dried kombu, a type of sea vegetable, to a pot of dried beans while they cooked. It was a practice carried in from older European and eventually Japanese trade knowledge, and it worked by breaking down the complex sugars in the beans that caused digestive discomfort. The kombu dissolved almost completely into the cooking liquid, leaving no flavor behind, but transforming the beans into something far more digestible and even creamier in texture. Women who used this trick rarely talked about it in terms of chemistry. They just knew that certain families had fewer complaints after a bean supper, and that kept the practice alive quietly from one knowing cook to the next. Amish kitchens ran on quiet intelligence that modern cooking has largely abandoned. The women who kept those kitchens understood preservation, patience, and the deep connection between how food was handled and how it finally tasted at the table. Here is where the story finishes. Cooling bread on a wooden rack let the loaf set slowly and evenly, protecting the bottom crust from turning tough the way metal wire racks sometimes did. A small thing, but every slice was better for it. Salting eggplant before cooking was never skipped. Salt drew out the bitter, trapped liquid, leaving flesh that was sweeter, firmer, and far more willing to absorb whatever it was cooked in. Modern recipes call this step unnecessary. 40 years of Amish cooking disagreed. A raw potato dropped into oversalted soup quietly absorbed the excess seasoning and was fished out 20 minutes later, given to the chickens, and never spoken of again. Supper was saved. Nothing was wasted. Storing eggs pointy end down kept the yolk perfectly centered inside the white, producing prettier deviled eggs and more evenly cooked breakfasts without any extra effort at all. Wrapping hard cheese in a cloth, barely dampened with apple cider vinegar, kept mold away and moisture in, stretching a good block of cheddar for weeks in the cool cellar without losing any of its quality. Rubbing a cut lemon across a salted wooden cutting board after a day of heavy chopping cleaned the grain, killed the odors, and left the surface smelling honest and fresh, without a single chemical involved. Saving dried citrus peels in a small jar through winter meant a pinch of orange or lemon could brighten a cake or a pot of preserves in February when fresh fruit was nothing but a memory. These tricks did not come from cookbooks. They came from women who understood that good food and careful living were the same thing, and that knowledge passed from one pair of hands to another was worth more than anything printed on a glossy page. The modern kitchen forgot most of this, but it is still there, waiting for anyone willing to slow down and pay attention.